The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber swing open with a heavy thud that echoes through the enormous hall. Inside, hundreds of alien representatives sit in floating pods, their strange forms creating shadows against the glowing walls. Some look like giant insects with multiple eyes. Others appear as living crystals that sparkle and change colors. A few resemble walking trees with bark-like skin and glowing sap running through visible veins. At the center of it all, one small figure walks alone across the polished floor. Ambassador Jin-A moves with quiet confidence, her simple black diplomatic uniform standing out against the elaborate costumes and natural forms surrounding her. Her footsteps echo in the silence as every alien eye follows her movement. For 6 long months, the coalition of worlds has been squeezing humanity like a vice. They started small at first, just questioning human trade permits and delaying cargo inspections. Then things got worse, much worse. Coalition forces began stopping human colony ships in deep space, turning away families who had sold everything for a chance at a new life on distant worlds. They set up blockades around human trade routes, demanding higher and higher taxes until some human merchants went bankrupt. The aliens claimed they were just following proper galactic procedures. They said humans needed to learn their place in the established order. After all, humanity had only been part of galactic society for 50 years. These other species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Who were these newcomers to demand equal treatment? Jin-A reaches the speaking platform at the center of the chamber. She places her hands on the podium and looks up at the towering representatives surrounding her. The Thrakari delegate, a massive creature covered in armor-like scales, makes a rumbling sound that might be laughter. The Nexian ambassador, whose body seems to be made of flowing liquid metal, ripples with what appears to be amusement. But Jin-A has been preparing for this moment her entire career. She served in the human military before becoming a diplomat. She studied every major galactic conflict of the past 1,000 years. She learned 17 alien languages and memorized the cultural customs of 43 different species. Most importantly, she knows exactly what humanity is capable of when pushed too far. The chamber's translation systems activate as she begins to speak. Her voice carries clearly to every corner of the vast space, automatically converted into dozens of different alien languages, but her tone remains perfectly calm, almost friendly, like she's having a casual conversation with old friends. She explains how the coalition has systematically targeted human interests. She lists every blocked trade route, every seized ship, every family forced to abandon their dreams of a new life among the stars. The evidence is overwhelming, but the alien representatives don't seem to care. Some are openly talking among themselves, ignoring her completely. Others make dismissive gestures with whatever appendages they use for communication. The Valian Prime Minister finally responds, his crystalline body glowing brighter as he speaks. His translated words drip with condescension, treating Jin-A like a child who doesn't understand how the adult world works. He explains that humans must learn patience, that they must prove themselves worthy of respect over many generations. This is the moment Jin-A has been waiting for. Her smile doesn't fade, but something changes in her eyes. The few aliens paying attention notice the shift, though they don't understand what it means. They're about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon isn't their technology or their numbers. It's their ability to remember exactly what they're capable of, and their wisdom in choosing not to use it until they absolutely have to. The ultimatum has been delivered. The choice now belongs to the coalition. The rejection comes swiftly. Within an hour of Jin-A's ultimatum, the Coalition Council votes unanimously to dismiss humanity's concerns. They laugh at the warning about Earth's moon and the goddess of the hunt. To them, it sounds like the desperate bluffing of a weak species trying to seem important. But then something extraordinary happens across the entire galaxy. Every screen in Coalition space suddenly goes dark. Television broadcasts cut out mid-sentence. Personal communication devices stop working. Even the massive public information displays in city centers flicker and die. For exactly 60 seconds, complete silence falls across thousands of worlds. Then, simultaneously, every single screen lights up again. But instead of regular programming, they all show the same thing: a simple room with wooden shelves lined with old books. Behind a plain desk sits a middle-aged human man with kind eyes and graying hair. He wears a comfortable sweater and has the calm demeanor of a favorite teacher. Dr. Hyunwoo introduces himself politely, as if he's meeting each viewer personally. He explains that he teaches history at Seoul University on Earth, specializing in human conflicts throughout the ages. His voice is gentle, almost grandfatherly, which makes what he's about to reveal even more unsettling. The alien viewers across Coalition space initially find his presentation boring. Many switch to other channels, only to discover that every single frequency is broadcasting the same lecture. Others dismiss it as primitive human propaganda. After all, what could these newcomers possibly teach civilizations that have been spacefaring for millennia? Dr. Hyunwoo begins with humanity's earliest recorded conflicts. He shows cave paintings depicting battles between tribes, explains how humans first learned to organize warfare, and describes the development of basic weapons. The aliens watching roll their eyes or make dismissive sounds. Stone spears and wooden clubs seem laughably primitive compared to their advanced energy weapons. But then the numbers start adding up. The professor methodically works through human history, conflict by conflict, war by war. He explains how humans fought each other for land, resources, ideology, and sometimes just for the sake of fighting. He describes civilizations that existed purely to wage war against their neighbors. He talks about technologies developed with no purpose other than to kill more efficiently. As the centuries roll by in his presentation, the alien audiences begin to pay closer attention. The primitive weapons give way to bronze swords, then iron, then steel. Armies grow larger, tactics become more sophisticated. The scale of destruction increases exponentially. Dr. Hyunwoo reaches the era of gunpowder and chemical explosives. He calmly explains how humans learned to kill each other from greater distances, in larger numbers, with increasing efficiency. He describes sieges that lasted for years, battles that killed hundreds of thousands in single days, and weapons designed specifically to cause maximum suffering. Some alien viewers begin to feel uncomfortable, but they tell themselves this is still primitive compared to modern galactic warfare. Then Dr. Hyunwoo reaches the industrial age. He explains how humans turned their factories into weapon-making facilities, how they developed poison gases, explosive shells, and machines designed purely for killing. He describes conflicts that consumed entire continents, wars where millions of soldiers died in muddy trenches, fighting for a few miles of worthless ground. The professor's voice never changes. He remains calm, academic, almost detached as he catalogues humanity's capacity for violence, but the information becomes increasingly disturbing. He talks about strategic bombing campaigns that leveled entire cities. He describes weapons that could kill everything in a radius of miles. He explains how humans learned to turn science itself into a tool of destruction. Coalition representatives who initially ignored the broadcast now watch with growing alarm. The humans aren't just describing random violence, they're demonstrating systematic, organized, industrial-scale warfare that lasted for centuries. Then Dr. Hyunwoo reaches the nuclear age. He explains in simple terms how humans learned to split atoms and harness the power of stars themselves. He describes weapons that could eliminate entire cities in seconds, leaving behind radiation that made the land uninhabitable for generations. The final part of his lecture covers humanity's space-age conflicts, wars fought in zero gravity, planet cracking, weapons, conflicts that span solar systems, technologies that could redirect asteroids, weaponize black holes, and turn stars into bombs. As Dr. Hyunwoo concludes his presentation, alien viewers across the galaxy sit in stunned silence. This isn't the history of a primitive species. This is the catalogue of a race that has spent 7,000 years perfecting the art of destruction, then chose to stop. His final words echo across Coalition space with quiet menace. We learned to control our violence not because we became weak, but because we became too dangerous to ourselves and others. The question you should be asking isn't whether we can fight. It's whether you really want to find out what we've been holding back. The Centauri system had always been humanity's crown jewel. 3 beautiful planets orbited a stable yellow star, each one perfect for human colonization. The first planet housed massive industrial complexes that produced everything from starship components to household goods. The second planet was covered in vast farms that fed dozens of human colonies across the galaxy. The third planet served as a major trading hub where merchants from across human space came to buy and sell their goods. For the Coalition, it was the perfect target. Admiral Corvus of the Thrakari fleet had spent months planning the blockade. His species took great pride in military precision, and Corvus was considered one of their finest strategic minds. He positioned exactly 1,000 ships in a perfect sphere around the entire Centauri system. Each ship was positioned with mathematical precision, their sensors overlapping to create a detection net so tight that even a single photon couldn't pass through. Unnoticed, the Admiral had studied human military tactics for years. He knew they relied heavily on surprise attacks and unconventional strategies, so he made sure his blockade was prepared for anything the humans might try. Fast attack ships patrolled the outer edges. Heavy cruisers formed the main defensive line. Massive battleships served as command centers, coordinating the entire operation. For weeks, the blockade worked perfectly. Human merchant ships arrived at the edge of Coalition space, saw the overwhelming display of military power, and turned back without even attempting to challenge the blockade. Some tried to negotiate, offering bribes or special trade deals, but Corvus turned them all away. He wanted the humans to understand their place in the galactic order. What the Admiral didn't realize was that some of those merchant ships never actually left. 17 human vessels had been sitting at the edge of the blockade for nearly a month. They appeared to be standard cargo haulers, the kind of boring, slow-moving ships that carried goods between human colonies. Their captains repeatedly requested permission to pass through Coalition space, always politely, always respectfully. Each time they were denied and told to return to human territory, but they didn't leave. Instead, they waited. The ships looked completely harmless. They showed up on Coalition sensors as exactly what they claimed to be: merchant vessels carrying agricultural products, manufactured goods, and civilian supplies. Their energy signatures were minimal. Their weapon systems appeared to be limited to basic defensive lasers. Most Coalition officers stopped paying attention to them after the first few days. This was humanity's first mistake that the Coalition failed to recognize. Humans are very, very good at looking harmless when they want to. On the morning of the attack, Admiral Corvus was reviewing patrol reports in his command center. The blockade had been running smoothly for 6 weeks. No human ships had successfully penetrated their perimeter. Several Coalition politicians were already praising Corvus for bringing the arrogant humans to heel without firing a single shot. Then, at exactly 10:30 Galactic Standard Time, everything went wrong. The 17 human merchant ships suddenly changed. Their hulls split open like flowers blooming, revealing hidden weapon systems and military-grade engines. But these weren't the energy cannons or missile launchers that Coalition forces expected. Instead, each ship released millions of tiny objects that looked like metallic dust. Coalition sensors couldn't properly identify what they were seeing. The objects were too small to be missiles, too numerous to be fighters, and too fast to be debris. They moved through space like living clouds, flowing around Coalition ships and passing through their shields without triggering any defensive systems. Admiral Corvus watched in growing alarm as his fleet status reports began changing from green to red. Ship after ship reported the same problem: total system failure, engines shut down, weapons stopped working, communication systems went dark, life support switched to emergency backup power. But here's the terrifying part: no one was getting hurt. The microscopic drones that swarmed through the Coalition fleet were incredibly sophisticated. They could disable any electronic system they encountered, but they were programmed to avoid causing harm to living beings. Ship after ship fell silent and dead in space, but their crews remained completely unharmed. Within 15 minutes, over half of the mighty Coalition blockade was floating helplessly. Hundreds of massive warships, each one representing years of construction and billions of credits in military investment, had been reduced to expensive scrap metal by what looked like metallic dust. The psychological impact was devastating. Coalition crews who had felt invincible just minutes earlier now found themselves completely helpless, dependent on their enemies for rescue. Admiral Corvus, sitting in his darkened command center with only emergency lighting, realized that humanity had just demonstrated something terrifying. They could have destroyed his entire fleet just as easily as they had disabled it. The message that followed was delivered in perfect Thrakari, spoken by a calm human voice. Admiral Corvus, this was a demonstration of restraint. We could have killed everyone in your fleet in the time it took us to disable them. Instead, we chose to show mercy. Our rescue ships are already on their way to evacuate your crews. Next time you point weapons at human civilians, we won't be so gentle. As Coalition rescue vessels scrambled to save thousands of stranded military personnel, one thing became crystal clear. Humanity had been holding back all along. The Coalition's best military scientists had been studying human technology for decades, and they thought they understood what humanity was capable of. Their analysis showed that humans used decent but unremarkable equipment. Human ships were fast but not exceptionally so. Human weapons were effective but nothing special. Human computers were advanced, but not beyond what other galactic civilizations had achieved. They were completely wrong. The first hint came when a human destroyer simply appeared inside the most secure Thrakari military shipyard in the galaxy. Not near the shipyard, not outside its defenses. Inside it, floating calmly between two half-built battleships, as if it had been there all along. The shipyard's defensive systems went into full alert. Klaxons wailed as automated weapons turned toward the intruder. But before they could even lock onto their target, a cheerful human voice came over the communication channels, speaking perfect Thrakari. "Hello there! Don't mind us. We're just borrowing a few spare parts. We'll bring them back when we're done." The bay. Human ship began scanning the Thrakari vessels with equipment that shouldn't have existed. Within seconds, it had downloaded complete blueprints of every ship design in the facility, along with detailed records of the shipyard's production capabilities, supply chains, and defensive systems. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the ship vanished. The entire incident lasted less than 3 minutes. The Thrakari defenders never even had time to fire a single shot. Coalition military commanders demanded answers. How had a human ship penetrated their most secure facility? How had it bypassed detection systems that should have spotted anything larger than a space pebble? Most importantly, how had it simply disappeared without leaving any trace? The answer came from an unexpected source, a captured human pilot named Captain Minho. His fighter had been shot down during a skirmish near the Nexian border. Coalition forces expected to find advanced military technology when they examined his aircraft. Instead, they found equipment that seemed almost primitive by their standards. The computer systems were simple. The weapons were basic energy cannons. Even the life support system used old-fashioned chemical filters, instead of the quantum recycling units that most galactic civilizations had adopted centuries ago. Coalition scientists were puzzled. How could such primitive technology have performed so well in combat? They decided to interrogate the pilot directly. Captain Minho was a relaxed, friendly man in his 30s who seemed completely unbothered by his capture. He answered questions honestly, often providing more information than his captors had asked for. He explained how his fighter's systems worked, described standard human military procedures, and even shared stories about his training. But it was during a casual conversation that he revealed something that changed everything. "Your ship's computer system is quite impressive," commented the lead interrogator. A brilliant Valian scientist named Crystalline thought of morning. "Our analysis suggests it can process nearly 1 million calculations per second." Minho laughed. "Oh, that old thing? Yeah, it's pretty basic. We use the same processing core in children's educational toys back home. Kids use them to play games and do homework." The interrogation room fell silent. Crystalline thought of morning's crystalline body stopped glowing as the implications sank in. "You're saying this military-grade computer is equivalent to a child's toy in human society?" Well, not exactly equivalent, Minho replied thoughtfully. The toys are actually a bit faster, but we don't need much processing power for basic flight controls and weapon targeting. The really sophisticated stuff is handled by other systems. What other systems? Minho smiled. Sorry, that's classified. But I can tell you that what you've captured here represents maybe, I'd say early 2300s technology. We're in 2387 now, so this stuff is pretty outdated. The Coalition scientists exchanged horrified glances. They had been analyzing what they thought was cutting-edge human military technology, only to discover it was nearly a century obsolete. If this was what humans considered outdated equipment, what were they actually capable of with their modern technology? Over the following days, more disturbing revelations emerged. Coalition intelligence discovered that human merchant ships had been visiting their facilities for years, always appearing as harmless traders, but somehow always managing to be in exactly the right place at the right time to observe military exercises, industrial processes, and classified research projects. The humans hadn't just been hiding their capabilities. They had been systematically studying Coalition technology, learning about their enemies' strengths and weaknesses, while deliberately presenting themselves as less advanced than they actually were. Coalition military planners realized they had been fighting a war where their opponents knew everything about them, while they knew nothing about their opponents' true capabilities. Every battle, every tactical decision, every strategic move had been made based on completely false assumptions about what humanity could actually do. Captain Minho, still cheerful and cooperative in his cell, summed up the situation perfectly. When asked about humanity's true military potential, "You know, my grandmother always told me that the smartest fighter is the one who wins without showing how strong they really are. But if you keep pushing us, eventually we'll have to stop pretending to be weaker than we are." He paused, then added with a gentle smile that somehow seemed more threatening than any angry threat, "Trust me, you really don't want to see what happens when we stop holding back." The Coalition was beginning to understand that they hadn't been fighting humanity's military. They had been fighting humanity's restraint, and that restraint was quickly running out. The Coalition's pride was wounded, and wounded pride makes even smart people do stupid things. After the humiliation of the Centauri blockade and the disturbing revelations about human technology, Coalition leaders faced a terrible choice. They could admit they had made a mistake and try to negotiate peace, or they could double down and hope that overwhelming force would somehow succeed where strategy had failed. They chose force. Operation Sovereign Strike was the largest military operation in Coalition history. Every major species contributed their most advanced warships, their deadliest weapons, and their best military commanders. The Thrakari provided their planet-killer battleships. The Valians contributed crystal-powered energy weapons that could cut through any known material. The Nexians brought gravity manipulators that could crush entire space stations. The target was Earth itself. Coalition strategists had studied humanity's homeworld carefully. Earth appeared to be protected by only a small defensive fleet of maybe 200 ships, most of them decades old. The planet had some orbital defense platforms, but nothing that looked particularly threatening compared to the massive armada the Coalition was assembling. Intelligence reports suggested that Earth's defenses were designed to handle pirates and raiders, not a full-scale military invasion. The Coalition convinced themselves that humans had concentrated their advanced technology in their outer colonies, leaving their homeworld relatively undefended because they never expected anyone to be bold enough to attack it directly. They were about to learn why Earth seemed so lightly defended. The Coalition fleet consisted of over 3,000 ships, representing the combined military might of 12 different civilizations. As they approached the solar system, their commanders felt confident. Earth looked exactly as their intelligence had described. A blue-green world orbited by a small defensive fleet and protected by what appeared to be outdated weapons platforms. The attack began precisely at dawn, Earth time. Coalition forces had timed their assault to catch the planet's defenders off guard, striking when most of Earth's military command would theoretically be asleep or off duty. Massive fusion missiles, each one capable of destroying an entire city, streaked toward Earth's major population centers. Particle beam arrays locked onto military installations and began charging for devastating strikes. Energy cannons targeted the small human defensive fleet, expecting to sweep it aside in the first few minutes of combat. For 13 terrifying minutes, it looked like the coalition would achieve total victory. Their weapons fired without interruption. Their targeting systems showed direct hits on dozens of important targets. Coalition commanders watched their displays with satisfaction as what appeared to be the complete destruction of humanity's homeworld unfolded before their eyes. Then something impossible happened. Earth's magnetic field, the same natural phenomenon that protects the planet from solar radiation, suddenly became active in ways that violated every known law of physics. The fusion missiles approaching major cities simply stopped in mid-air, caught by invisible magnetic forces and redirected harmlessly into space. Energy beams aimed at military targets were deflected back at the ships that had fired them, destroying coalition vessels with their own weapons. But that was just the beginning. The seemingly empty space around Earth began to fill with objects that hadn't been there moments before. Hundreds of massive defense platforms materialized out of nowhere, each one bristling with weapons that made coalition technology look like children's toys. These weren't the simple orbital stations that had shown up on coalition sensors. These were fortress-sized installations that had somehow been completely invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. Coalition fleet commanders watched in horror as their carefully planned attack fell apart. Ships that had been advancing confidently toward Earth found themselves surrounded by weapons platforms that had appeared from nothing. Energy shields that were supposed to protect coalition vessels were torn apart by human weapons that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. But the most shocking moment came when Earth's moon began to change. What everyone had assumed was a natural satellite suddenly started to unfold. The familiar grey surface split open like the petals of a mechanical flower, revealing an internal structure that defied imagination. The moon wasn't a moon at all. It was the largest artificial construct anyone had ever seen, disguised to look like a celestial body. From the moon's hidden interior emerged weapons that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. Energy beams that could slice battleships in half, gravitational manipulators that crumpled warships like paper. And at the very center, a weapon so large that it dwarfed some of the smaller coalition ships. The coalition's mighty armada, which had taken months to assemble and represented the combined military might of 12 civilizations, was reduced to floating debris in exactly 17 minutes. Only a handful of coalition ships survived, and only because the humans chose to let them live. As rescue beacons activated throughout the wreckage of what had once been the galaxy's most powerful military force, the survivors received a transmission from Earth Defense Command. Admiral So Young's voice was calm, almost gentle, as she addressed the few remaining coalition commanders. "You demanded to see what humanity is really capable of. What you just witnessed was us being polite. This was our way of giving you a demonstration without completely destroying your civilizations. If you attack us again, we won't be so gentle." The message ended with words that would haunt coalition nightmares for generations. Earth has been preparing for this day since we first learned we weren't alone in the universe. You've seen our children's toys. You've witnessed our training exercises. Now you've experienced our patience. Pray you never see our anger. The survivors of Operation Sovereign Strike limped back to coalition space, carrying news that no one wanted to believe. Earth's defenses had been beyond anything they could have imagined. The human homeworld wasn't just protected. It was a fortress disguised as a planet, surrounded by weapons that shouldn't have been possible to build. Coalition leaders went into emergency session. Some wanted to surrender immediately, admitting their mistake and begging for mercy. Others argued for regrouping their remaining forces and trying a different approach. A few extremists even suggested using planet-killing weapons, though they were quickly shouted down when someone pointed out that humans had already demonstrated they could redirect such attacks back at their sources. But while the coalition argued and debated, something far more terrifying was already happening throughout their space. The first sign came from a military outpost on the edge of Thrakari territory. The base had been there for over a century, monitoring space traffic and serving as an early warning system for potential threats. GAT housed 3,000 military personnel and was protected by some of the most advanced defensive systems in Coalition space. One morning, it simply wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed. Gone. Where the base had once orbited a small asteroid, there was now nothing but empty space, and a single message burned into the asteroid's surface in letters a kilometer tall. You chose this. Coalition investigators who arrived at the scene found no debris, no energy signatures, no trace of what had happened to the base or its crew. It was as if 3,000 people and their entire military installation had never existed. The only evidence that anything had been there was the message and a lingering smell in the air that reminded survivors of ozone after a lightning strike. Similar reports began flooding in from across Coalition space. Military installations would be operating normally one day and completely vanish the next. Supply convoys carrying critical resources would drop off communication networks mid-journey. Patrol fleets would fail to report in at scheduled times. The terrifying part wasn't just that Coalition forces were disappearing, it was how they were disappearing. Search and rescue teams would find Coalition crew members weeks later on remote, uninhabited planets, sitting around campfires with no memory of how they had gotten there. They remembered starting their missions normally, then waking up on strange worlds with supplies that would last exactly long enough for rescue teams to find them. The missing personnel were always unharmed, but deeply shaken. They spoke of shadowy figures that moved without sound, of being surrounded by enemies they never saw clearly, of voices that spoke from the darkness in perfect translations of their native languages. Some reported dreams of being studied like laboratory specimens, though they couldn't be sure if the dreams were real. Coalition military analysts tried desperately to find patterns in the attacks. They studied star charts, troop movements, and supply routes, looking for any clue about how the humans were choosing their targets. But the attacks seemed random, unpredictable, striking at heavily defended installations and lightly guarded supply ships with equal ease. Admiral Vorthak, one of the Coalition's most experienced military commanders, spent sleepless nights reviewing the tactical reports. As a young officer, he had studied every major conflict in galactic history. He understood siege warfare, fleet battles, and planetary invasions. But what the humans were doing didn't fit any known military doctrine. During a briefing with his senior staff, Vorthak made an observation that sent chills through everyone present. Look at these attack patterns. They're not trying to capture territory or destroy our ability to fight. They're not targeting our most important military assets or our civilian populations. They're hunting us. He pulled up a holographic display showing Coalition losses over the past month. Red dots marked every disappeared base, every missing convoy, every vanished patrol. See how they're spreading us thin, making us afraid to group our forces together? They're using our own defensive instincts against us. We're behaving exactly like prey animals, scattering, hiding, becoming isolated and vulnerable. One of his junior officers, a young Nexian named Flowing Current of Thought, asked the question everyone was thinking. But Admiral, if they can make our forces disappear so easily, why haven't they just eliminated all of us at once? Vorthak's expression darkened. Because they don't want to eliminate us quickly. They want us to understand what's happening to us. They want us to feel helpless. They're not just defeating us militarily, they're breaking us psychologically. As if to prove his point, the communication system in the briefing room suddenly activated. Their calm human voice filled the air, speaking in perfect Coalition standard. Good evening, Admiral Vorthak. We hope you're enjoying our tactical demonstration. Security alarms began wailing as Coalition officers realized their most secure command center had been compromised, but the human voice continued without concern. You've spent decades studying our weaknesses, learning our capabilities, planning how to defeat us. But you made one critical error. You assumed we weren't doing the same thing to you. The voice belonged to Commander Jamin, though Coalition intelligence had no record of any human officer by that name. For years, we've been watching your military exercises, mapping your supply lines, studying your tactics. We know how you think, how you fight, how you make decisions under pressure. You're not fighting an enemy. You're being hunted by predators who have been planning this hunt for longer than you can imagine. The transmission ended with words that would haunt Coalition forces for the remainder of the war. The hunt has begun. Run if you want. Hide if you can. But remember, we learned to track our prey across continents long before we learned to cross between stars. As Coalition forces throughout the galaxy received similar messages, one thing became crystal clear: humanity had stopped playing games. The restraint they had shown earlier in the conflict was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying. The focused attention of apex predators who had finally decided to stop pretending they were anything else. The Coalition was falling apart, piece by piece, like a building collapsing in slow motion. Every day brought new reports of missing fleets, vanished bases, and military personnel found wandering on distant planets with no memory of how they got there. What had started as a confident campaign to put humanity in its place had become a nightmare that kept Coalition leaders awake at night. Desperate messages began flooding human communication channels. Coalition diplomats who had once sneered at human ambassadors now begged for meetings. They offered trade concessions, territorial agreements, even formal apologies for their earlier actions. Some Coalition species offered to pay massive reparations if humanity would just stop the relentless hunt that was tearing their military apart. But every attempt at negotiation received the same cold response. The time for negotiation ended when you rejected our final warning. The humans weren't interested in compromise anymore. They had tried diplomacy, and the Coalition had laughed at them. They had shown restraint, and the Coalition had seen it as weakness. They had given clear warnings, and the Coalition had chosen to ignore them. Now humanity was demonstrating exactly what happened when a species pushed them beyond their breaking point. Coalition military strategists desperately searched for some way to turn the tide. They pulled back their remaining forces to heavily defended positions, hoping that concentration of firepower might succeed where scattered deployments had failed. Their last major stronghold was Drakmor, a fortress world that had never fallen to enemy attack in over 1,000 years of galactic warfare. Drakmor was everything a military commander could want in a defensive position. The planet was covered in overlapping shield generators, weapons platforms, and sensor arrays. Underground bunkers could house millions of soldiers. The orbital space around the world bristled with automated defense stations and patrol fleets. Coalition High Command had spent decades and countless resources making Drakmor absolutely impregnable. It should have been impossible to conquer. The attack on Drakmor began not with explosions or space battles, but with the lights going out. Power. Grids across the planet simply shut down, plunging entire continents into darkness. Emergency backup systems activated automatically, but they too failed within minutes. Military commanders tried to contact their orbital defenses, only to discover that their communication networks were no longer responding to their commands. Then the defense systems came back online, but they were no longer under Coalition control. Anti-aircraft batteries that were supposed to protect Coalition military bases began targeting those same bases instead. Orbital defense platforms turned their weapons toward the planet's surface and began systematically destroying every military installation in sight. Shield generators reversed their polarity, trapping Coalition forces inside protective barriers that had become prisons. The population of Drakmor watched in horror as their own defenses turned against them, but the terror deepened when they realized this wasn't some malfunction or computer virus. The systems were operating with perfect precision, carefully avoiding civilian areas while methodically eliminating every military target on the planet. As the destruction continued, every communication device on Drakmor began broadcasting the same message. A calm human voice explained exactly what was happening and why. The humans had been inside Drakmor's computer systems for over 2 years, quietly studying every system, mapping every network, and preparing for this exact moment. "We've been watching you build your fortress," the voice explained. "We've been inside your computers, your communication networks, your power grids, and your defense systems, since the day you started treating our merchant ships as enemies. Every time you upgraded your security, we were already there. Every time you added new defenses, we were helping design them through the companies you hired. The revelation was devastating. Coalition forces realized that their enemies hadn't just been studying their military tactics. They had been manipulating their entire infrastructure for years. Human agents hadn't infiltrated Coalition space. They had been invited in as traders, engineers, and consultants, quietly building back doors into every system they touched. As Coalition survivors fled Drakmor in whatever ships they could find, they encountered something even more disturbing than the planet's fall. Human vessels appeared throughout the system, but they didn't attack the fleeing Coalition forces. Instead, they simply watched. The human ships followed the Coalition retreat at a comfortable distance, like scientists observing the behavior of laboratory animals. They made no threatening moves, fired no weapons, and sent no messages. They just watched as Coalition forces panicked, scattered, and fled toward what they hoped would be safety. It was only later that Coalition High Command realized the horrible truth. Humanity had been herding them. Every safe route the Coalition forces had taken, every secure system they had retreated to, every defensive position they had chosen, all of it had been subtly influenced by human actions. The Coalition thought they were making their own strategic decisions, but they were actually following a path that humanity had been preparing for months. The psychological breaking point came when Fleet Admiral Yunji appeared simultaneously on every Coalition communication frequency in the galaxy. Unlike the previous human messages, this one wasn't delivered by a diplomat or a historian. Admiral Yunji wore the dark uniform of the Human Fleet Command, and her voice carried the cold authority of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. "Coalition forces," she began, "you asked for war. You demanded to see humanity's true nature. For months we've been showing you what we're capable of while still exercising restraint. We've disabled your ships instead of destroying them. We've relocated your personnel instead of eliminating them. We've used sabotage instead of annihilation." Her image appeared on screens throughout Coalition space, in government buildings, military command centers, and civilian homes. "But our patience has limits. You've seen what we can do when we're being gentle. You've witnessed what happens when we're trying to minimize casualties. You've experienced warfare where we still care about your survival." The Admiral paused, and something in her expression changed. The professional mask slipped away, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. "The question you need to ask yourselves now is simple. Would you like to see what we can do when we stop caring whether you live or die?" The transmission ended, leaving Coalition space in stunned silence. For the first time since the war began, humanity had stopped pretending to be the reasonable party in the conflict. The gloves were finally coming off, and the Coalition was about to discover what humanity looked like when they decided to stop being civilized. The Nexus system had always been considered the most strategically important location in Coalition space. 7 major hyperspace routes converged there, making it the perfect place for trade, communication, and military coordination. It was also the most heavily defended system in the galaxy, with massive fortress stations, patrol fleets, and weapon platforms that could destroy entire armadas. Now it served as the Coalition's final refuge. The remnants of 12 different military forces had gathered in the Nexus system for what everyone understood would be their last stand. Barely 300 ships remained from the thousands that had once comprised the Coalition's mighty armada. These survivors were the best of the best, elite units that had managed to escape the relentless human hunt that had consumed the rest of their forces. Coalition commanders knew they couldn't win, but they hoped to at least inflict enough damage to force humanity to negotiate. Perhaps if they could destroy a significant number of human ships, they could bargain for some kind of conditional surrender that would allow their civilizations to survive with some dignity intact. They were about to learn that dignity was no longer an option. The human fleet that emerged from hyperspace was unlike anything the Coalition had ever seen. These weren't the modest destroyers and cruisers that humanity had used in earlier engagements. These weren't even the advanced warships that had devastated Earth's attackers. These were vessels that seemed to bend the laws of physics just by existing. Some of the human ships were larger than space stations. Others appeared to be made of pure energy, shifting and flowing like liquid lightning. A few seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their outlines blurring and changing as they moved through space in ways that hurt to look at directly. But the ships themselves weren't the most terrifying part. It was what they began to do to the Nexus system itself. The first sign that this battle would be unlike anything in galactic history came when the system's star began to change color. The yellow dwarf that had burned steadily for billions of years suddenly shifted. To blue, then white, then colors that didn't have names. Coalition sensors detected massive gravitational fluctuations as the star's output increased by orders of magnitude. Humanity was using the star as a weapon. Streams of stellar plasma, controlled and directed by technology that shouldn't have been possible, reached across millions of kilometers to engulf coalition defensive positions. Fortress stations that had withstood every assault in their 1,000-year history were consumed by solar fire in seconds, but that was just the beginning. Coalition forces watched in horror as the planets in the Nexus system began to move, not slowly, like natural orbital mechanics, but quickly and deliberately, like pieces on a chessboard. Gas giants were repositioned to block escape routes. Rocky worlds were accelerated to incredible speeds and used as massive projectiles. The E-System's asteroid belt was reorganized into geometric patterns that served some incomprehensible strategic purpose. Space itself became a weapon as humanity demonstrated technologies that violated every known law of physics. Sections of vacuum were somehow made solid, creating barriers that coalition weapons couldn't penetrate. Other areas of space were turned into traps that collapsed into microscopic black holes when ships tried to pass through them. Coalition Admiral Thax, commanding the last major fleet elements, tried desperately to coordinate some kind of response, but his forces were facing enemies that could manipulate reality itself. Human ships appeared and disappeared at will, striking from impossible angles and vanishing before return fire could reach them. The most disturbing part wasn't the overwhelming technological superiority the humans displayed. It was the casual efficiency with which they dismantled centuries of coalition military development. They weren't struggling or straining to achieve these impossible feats. They were demonstrating capabilities that seemed effortless, almost routine. As coalition resistance crumbled, something even more terrifying became clear. The humans were still holding back, despite wielding power that bordered on godlike, despite demonstrating the ability to move planets and weaponize stars. The humans were still being careful to minimize casualties. Coalition crews found themselves transported to safety moments before their ships were destroyed. Life support systems continued functioning even on vessels that had been completely disabled. Escape pods were guided to safe areas by invisible hands. Even at the height of their unleashed power, humanity was still choosing mercy over annihilation. The battle, if it could even be called a battle, lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the Coalition's last military forces floated helplessly in space, their weapons disabled, their ships inoperable, but their crews alive and unharmed. The surrender came not as a dramatic military ceremony, but as a quiet acknowledgement of defeat. Coalition leaders, realizing that continued resistance was not just futile, but potentially suicidal for their entire species, transmitted unconditional surrender on all frequencies. Then, as the last echoes of battle faded, a familiar voice appeared on communication systems throughout the galaxy. Ambassador Jinne, the same diplomat who had delivered humanity's final warning so many months ago, addressed not just the defeated coalition forces, but every civilization in galactic space. "You called us weak because we chose peace," she said, her voice carrying the weight of recent events. "You saw our restraint and mistook it for inability. You interpreted our diplomacy as evidence that we were inferior to your ancient civilizations." The image showed her standing on the bridge of a human command ship, with the transformed Nexus system visible through the viewports behind her. Stars that had been moved to new positions, planets reorganized according to human design, and space, itself reshaped by technologies that seemed more like magic than science. "Now you understand the truth," Janae continued. We didn't choose peace because we were incapable of war. We chose peace because we're too good at it. We didn't seek diplomatic solutions because we were weak. We sought them because we knew what would happen if diplomacy failed. As she spoke, human ships throughout the galaxy began the process of withdrawal, but they also began something else: reconstruction. The same technologies that had been used to devastate coalition forces were now employed to rebuild what had been destroyed, to heal what had been broken, to restore what had been lost. Our greatest strength was never our weapons or our technology, the ambassador concluded. It was our choice to be better than what we were capable of becoming. You forced us to show you what we could do. Now we're choosing to show you who we really are. The galaxy would never forget the lesson humanity had taught. When humans warned someone to back down, it wasn't a threat. It was an act of mercy. And when they said, "Welcome to hell," they weren't promising to take you there. They were warning you that you had just convinced them to bring hell to you.